Ruthie Mae McCoy was terrified. "Someone has threatened my life," she gasped to the woman next to her. They were riding in a van that was taking them home from an outpatient psychiatric center. The woman urged McCoy to relate her fears to a staff member at the clinic, but McCoy said she didn't want to get anyone else involved. Ruthie went through much of her life afraid. She was hounded by paranoia. Her fears were not soothed by her dwelling place the last 4 years, a high-rise building in a near South Side Chicago Housing Authority project known as ABLA, where the van dropped her off that Wednesday afternoon, April 22nd. She lived in one of the 7 15-story, brown, Y-shaped towers named the Grace Abbott Homes, the most dangerous buildings in ABLA. A claustrophobe in a closet would be more at ease than a paranoid person like McCoy in an Abbott high-rise. The buildings featured dark, malfunctioning elevators, pitch-black stairwells, and drug addicts on nearly every floor. Fiends really were lurking in the shadows there. In those towers, you'd be crazy if you're not always looking over your shoulder. McCoy lived at the end of a corridor on the 11th floor of the building at 1440 West 13th Street. At 8:45 that April evening, Chicago police got a 911 call from McCoy. "I'm a resident at 1440 West 13th Street, and some people next door are totally tearing this down, you know," the frantic voice began. "What are they doing, ma'am?" asked the dispatcher. McCoy's response was unintelligible on tape, but apparently the dispatcher caught her gist. "They're trying to break in?" he asked. "Yeah, they throwed the cabinet down." "From where?" "I'm in the projects. I'm on the other side. You can reach my bathroom. They want to come in through the bathroom." "All right, ma'am. What's the address?" 1440 West 13th Street, apartment 1109. The elevator's working." 1109? All right. What's your name, ma'am? "Ruth McCoy." "All right. I'll send you the police." The dispatcher wasn't certain what McCoy had been trying to report. Nevertheless, he closed the phone call in order to send a car. He assigned a 12th District car to answer a disturbance with a neighbor complaint. That he didn't report the call as a break-in attempt may explain why police hadn't yet arrived at McCoy's door at 9:02 when they received another 911 call concerning her apartment. This was from a woman who had been walking through the hallway and heard gunshots from the apartment. At 9:04, another neighbor called to report gunshots and hollering from 1109. 2 more police cars headed to the scene. 4 officers apparently arrived at McCoy's door around 10 minutes after 9. They pounded on the door, announced their presence, and called for McCoy. No answer. They asked the dispatcher to call McCoy on her phone. "We think somebody may be in there holding somebody," an officer told the dispatcher on the radio. From outside the door, the officers listened to the phone inside ring and ring. There were 2 more officers downstairs, and they drove over to the project office, a block away on Loomis, to get the key to 1109. But the key didn't fit McCoy's lock. This left officers wondering what to do. Should they break into the apartment? Talking with neighbors didn't help much. Nobody answered across the hall. The apartment next door was vacant, and the neighbors in the apartment down the hall said no, they hadn't heard or seen a thing. Other neighbors said an elderly woman lived in 1109. "They say she always answers her door," one of the officers told the dispatcher in a hesitant voice. "So, I don't know if maybe she answered to the wrong person or what." The officers contacted the office again, but the janitor there said he had no other key. And so, at 9:48 p.m., the police left. The following evening, police got a call from Deborah Losley, an 11th floor neighbor of McCoy's. Deborah said that McCoy normally stopped by her apartment on her way out of the building every morning, and upon her return in the afternoon. But this day, she hadn't stopped by at all. Losley had seen police at McCoy's door the night before, and was worried. About a half-dozen police officers and 4 or 5 security guards from the Chicago Housing Authority arrived on the scene. But their knocks and calls for McCoy went unanswered. The police thought they ought to break down the door, but the security guards discouraged them and raised the possibility of the tenant suing if the police broke in. And if you bust down the door, the security guards told the police officers, you will have to get someone back up here to secure it. So the police officers shrugged it off and left. The next day, Losley notified the project office of her concerns. At about 1 p.m., a project official arrived at McCoy's door with a carpenter, who drilled through the lock. They found papers, magazines, and coins thrown around on the floor. The faint smell of rotting flesh rose through the apartment. They found her in the bedroom, lying on her side in a pool of blood, a hand over her chest, with one shoe on and one off. Ruth McCoy was pronounced dead at Cook County Hospital on Friday, April 24, 1987, at 4:35 p.m. She'd been shot 4 times. A bullet passed through her left shoulder, another through her left thigh. The third pierced her abdomen, passing through her liver and exiting the other side. The fourth, and fatal bullet, went through her right arm into her chest, where it severed the pulmonary vein. The official cause of death was internal bleeding, and she didn't die immediately, the coroner said. But unless there's something extraordinary about it, or unless there's a news hole needing plugging, a murder in a CHA project wasn't going to make the headlines. Killings in the projects just weren't news ordinarily. Residents were blown away, knifed, and kicked to death almost every week, 2 or 3 times a week in warmer weather. In fact, McCoy was only one of 3 residents murdered in the waning days of April. 2 days after her body was found, unknown assailants beat to death a 40-year-old man just 2 blocks east of McCoy's building. 3 days after that, a 25-year-old woman ended an argument with a 20-year-old resident of McCoy's building by plunging a knife into her chest. In CHA towers, babies were tossed out of windows and teenagers shoved down elevator chutes. Intruders sometimes busted right through the apartment walls. Only the Black-owned Chicago Defender found it necessary to cover the murder of a middle-aged, mentally ill CHA tenant. The Chicago Tribune did run a brief story on the McCoy murder on June 10th, after a second suspect had been arrested and indicted. The killing was apparently now newsworthy because of a new fact. Detectives had determined that McCoy's killers had entered her apartment through her medicine cabinet. They removed the cabinet in the adjacent apartment, then broke through McCoy's and climbed through the wall into her apartment. Not many were shocked, says an Abbott janitor. You get desensitized by what goes on here every day. It's animalism over here, where you worry about those who are stronger and you care nothing about those who are weaker. The mode of entry didn't startle residents of the high-rises. Abbott intruders had been breaking into their apartments through medicine cabinets for at least a year. Even the dullest youth there knew that you could slither from one apartment to the adjacent one through the pipe chase, about 2.5 feet across between the cabinets. The cabinets themselves were no obstacle, secured by only 6 nails. In some areas of the building, you could even climb vertically in the walls to an apartment above or below the one you started in. It's the way to go from one apartment to the next, even if you're not killing nobody, the janitor said. Gangs who took over a pair of adjacent vacant apartments would now often link them by taking down the medicine cabinets, providing an escape route should security or police enter one of the apartments. This escape hatch was particularly effective, said one detective, because the medicine cabinet opening is only about 1.5 feet wide, and there are pipes to squirm past. A lot of policemen wouldn't be able to make it through there. As for the officer's failure to enter McCoy's apartment, well, there wasn't much of an investigation. The captain said that he informally spoke with the officers and felt satisfied that they had acted properly, though it was a tough decision, a coin toss. The identities of the responding officers were never released to the public. Had the 911 calls come from somewhere other than a housing project, the officers perhaps would have forcibly entered, said the captain. But so many calls from the projects are hoaxes. Jim Budelspacher, chair of the 911 Committee for the Association of Public Safety Communications Officers, said he knew of no study indicating that calls from housing projects or poor neighborhoods are more likely to be unfounded. There were, on the other hand, several studies indicating that police officers were unduly distrustful of reports of crime from the poor and black. Margaret Burridge, McCoy's former next-door neighbor, said she used to call police frequently when she heard fights in the halls or sounds like someone was trying to break into an apartment. After a while, I didn't bother no more, she said. They wouldn't never come up. I think them police is scared of that building just as well as we were, says former resident Perry Smith. They come, find out the elevator's not working, and go back out the door. They're not walking up those stairs. It's probably because of this belief that McCoy made a point of saying the elevator was working when she called 911. The Abbott homes were a place where elevators would sit out of order for days, and burned-out light bulbs in the stairwells weren't replaced for weeks, and apartments would remain vacant for months. So some felt that finding a body in a day and a half was pretty efficient. Beneath the more sensational details of the McCoy murder is the story of Ruthie herself, a mentally ill woman trying to survive. Miss May, as she was known at Abbott, was known to dress like a bag lady, curse at strangers, and wave a stick at teenagers in her path. But she had turned over a new leaf in the months before her death, neighbors said. She was dressing decently, she was often even pleasant. She left the project early most weekday mornings, and said she was going to school. 2 months before her death, McCoy had gotten approved to receive federal aid for the physically and mentally disabled. This raised her monthly income from $154 to $340. SSI is paid retroactive to the date of application, and McCoy had applied in September. So the first check she was sent, dated February 10th, was a big one. McCoy intended to use most of her windfall to get out of public housing, but she also bought a few things: a plain winter coat and some clothing and inexpensive household items. People in the project noticed. Detectives think the killers invaded her apartment because they figured she had a tidy sum stashed there. The money she planned to use to get out of Abbott Homes may have gotten her killed instead. McCoy's cabinet was never found, and it's not known whether it was in place before the intruders came through the wall. Ruthie's daughter, Vernita, believed that burglars broke into her mother's apartment through the cabinet once the year before, and that although Ruthie reported the break-in, no one ever re-secured the cabinet. The project office insisted that there was no record in McCoy's housing file of her ever reporting a break-in or problem of any sort with the medicine cabinet. A few relatives attended the service held for her on the South Side on April 30th. She was buried in Homewood that afternoon. Life was hard for Ruthie Mae, noted the bulletin distributed at the service. She was born in Hughes, Arkansas, one of 8 children. When she was small, her family, like numerous Southern black families then, moved to Chicago's South Side, looking for a more prosperous life. But the promise of the big city was sweeter than the reality. Just scraping along was a challenge for a large family in the teeming Black Belt. Ruthie attended Phillips High School for a little more than a year. Signs of mental illness began appearing when she was in her 20s. Her relatives said she started talking to herself and would burst with anger unexpectedly. Ruthie was 27 when Vernita, her only child, was born at Cook County Hospital. The father didn't stick around long, and his desertion left Ruthie Mae bitter at men in general. Ruthie worked some menial jobs as a laundromat attendant and housekeeper, but her mental problems prevented her from holding a job more than a month or two, and she spent most of her adult life on aid. She lived with Vernita in Dearborn Homes, a housing project on the south side, and then in cramped apartments on the south and west sides. Vernita spent some time in Cook County Jail in 1983 after being convicted of aggravated battery. Ruthie Mae took care of Vernita's 1-year-old while she was away. When her basement apartment in Humboldt Park flooded, Ruthie Mae applied for emergency housing. She wrote a letter asking to be placed in Wentworth Gardens on the south side and near family, and in another letter, she asked specifically not to be placed in a high-rise. But beggars can't be choosers, and she was offered an 11th floor unit in the Abbott Homes. In May of 1983, she moved into apartment 1109. About 3,600 people lived in the Abbott Homes at that time, all of them black, most of them younger than 18. The 1980 census found that the average family in the homes was pulling in only $4,500 a year, equal to about $17,000 today. About 85% of the families were headed by women. The lucky few, about 580 people, lived in 33 two-story row houses, while everyone else was placed in 7 high-rises. Residents of Abla were victims of violent crime more than twice as often as the rest of the city. Even by public housing project standards, the place was bad news. Abla ranked significantly worse than Cabrini Green, but because Cabrini sat right next to the posh neighborhood of Gold Coast and the lakefront, that was the project that got the most attention. And Abbott Homes' layout was practically designed as if to facilitate crime. The high-rises were bound by highways, creating a little island with no through streets, which was meant to give residents more recreational space and a heightened sense of community. But the lack of through streets only helped isolate the project from the rest of the world. No one could even drive through the development. For residents, there was no need for streets, as most of them didn't go anywhere. Fear kept them pinned to their apartments day in and day out. Something harder to understand welded many residents to that place for generations. They had kids and grandkids down the hall. In a 1972 study of New York City high-rises, renowned housing expert Oscar Newman found that crime rates increased with the height of buildings, the size of the projects, and the distance of the buildings from the street. Superblocks of high-rises like Abbott Homes were, in terms of crime, the worst possible combination for public housing. The buildings promoted anonymous living, making it less likely that residents would look out for each other. And the lack of streets isolated the project and made routine surveillance difficult. In no project would you find stairwells darker or more forbidding than those in the Abbott Towers. Other projects had natural light in the stairwells, but Abbott's corridors were completely enclosed. So when the light bulbs were burned out or missing, it was pitch black. And the light bulbs were burned out or missing most of the time. There used to be 3 janitors per high-rise at Abbott, the janitor said. Now there's just 1. You got too much work to do to keep going to get light bulbs. Then when you go, there's not any bulbs, or they give you just a few. And then you put the bulbs in, and the tenants steal them. Like the light bulbs, tenants descended on vacant, unboarded apartments like piranhas, stripping them in no time of everything of value: sinks, cabinets, doorknobs, and light bulbs. Then there wouldn't be adequate time or supplies to make the place habitable again. So in the building where McCoy lived, 42 of 148 units were vacant. The bathroom break-ins had started about a year and a half before, according to residents. 4 out of the 10 apartments on each floor were vulnerable. The pairs at the end of each floor's 2 main corridors. The other apartments didn't have the back-to-back medicine cabinets. If you lived at the end of a hall and the adjacent apartment was vacant or housing some unsavory squatters, you were easy prey. It's real scary, the idea that locking your door might not be enough, said another resident of McCoy's building. Her apartment was at the end of a floor, and the adjacent unit was vacant and not even locked. It didn't even have a doorknob. But even if the adjacent apartment wasn't vacant, there would be cause to worry. Alice Johnson was watching TV one evening with a friend when she saw a figure dart out of her bathroom and race out the front door. Noises in the bathroom alerted her to a second intruder, a 13-year-old boy whose girth slowed him as he attempted to squirm out of the opening, where Johnson's medicine cabinet had been until the first intruder removed it. Johnson's friend held the 13-year-old while Johnson called the police. The teen confessed that he and the first boy had climbed up the pipes from a vacant apartment below, and that 2 more boys had been behind him in the wall, but retreated. For several months, Johnson tied a rope to the bathroom door at bedtime, pulled the door shut, and tied the other end to her kid's bunk bed. She put out a pail of water for her kids to use as a nighttime toilet. Other residents positioned furniture in front of the bathroom doors before going to bed. Her first 2 years in the homes, Ruthie Mae shared her 2-bedroom apartment with Vernita's 2 young children, and her boyfriend, Louis Butler. In 1985, largely because of tension between Butler and Ruthie Mae, Vernita, Butler, and the kids moved out. Their departure depressed Ruthie Mae, neighbors said. She especially missed seeing her grandchildren daily. She began to live in constant fear of being mugged or burglarized. She had her lock changed at least twice, housing records showed. Neighbors described how she sometimes would tour the 11th floor hallway, turning doorknobs and lecturing tenants whose doors she found unlocked. She began eating irregularly, and her weight dropped quickly. Her behavior was becoming more bizarre. In the winter, she was seen lying in the snow near the building, spreading her arms and legs and making angels. And on hot summer days, she wore a winter coat and several pairs of pants. On August 10th, 1986, Ruthie Mae arrived at the emergency room of Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center with Vernita's older son, 4-year-old Bobby. The child had deep cuts on his face, arms, and legs. Ruthie said she had been sitting for him and that he had fallen down the stairs. The Department of Children and Family Services was called. When Ruthie got wind of this, she went berserk and had to be put in leather restraints. The hospital was able to reach Vernita, who came to pick up Bobby and sign the commitment papers for Ruthie Mae, who was taken to the nearby Illinois State Psychiatric Institute. DCFS has no record of ever investigating to see if Ruthie Mae had abused her grandchild. Vernita said she saw no signs of abuse by Ruthie Mae. Ruthie was diagnosed as a residual-type schizophrenic, which is characterized by an absence of prominent behavioral problems, but continuing evidence of some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, such as social isolation, peculiar behavior, or odd beliefs. Ruthie Mae was discharged on September 18th. Afterwards, many noted that her hygiene improved, as well as her communication skills. By the beginning of the following year, she was participating in GED classes, as well as group therapy sessions and craft projects. Because of Ruthie's age, the GED teacher, Linda Norman, was skeptical when she first signed up for the classes. Ruthie scored at only the 7th grade level on the placement test, but she proved to be an alert, bright student, as well as a dependable one, who rarely missed any of the 3 weekly sessions. By April, she was up to the 9th grade level, and 6 months more, Norman said, she would have earned her GED certificate. And her neighbors noticed the changes. Deborah Lossley noted that Ruthie had gained weight and was dressing and acting more appropriately. For the first time, she seemed enthusiastic about her life. Before, she mainly talked about how much she missed her daughter and her grandbabies. But now, she had begun discussing her own future. She said she wanted to be a nurse. She said, "When I get my GED, I'm going to get me a job, get myself together." She was getting back on track. But what she talked about most, to neighbors and to clients and staff members at the center, was how dreadful she continued to find life in the Abbott homes. She said, "People are coming into my house and taking my money." She was afraid to stay there by herself. She used to say, "I wish somebody would come and live with me." She asked CHA officials several times for a transfer to a lower floor or a row house, but Ruthie Mae's request was never granted. She realized that what she really needed was to get out of the project altogether, but she couldn't afford to leave. Her apartment cost her just $46 a month, and her assistance of $154 wouldn't allow her to pay for anything better. But when she started receiving SSI in February, she was able to begin planning her move out. A CHA spokesperson said McCoy apparently had her lock changed on her own, against the rules, and didn't give the project office a key. Tenants could get their locks changed by the CHA under certain circumstances, but because it often took weeks to get around to the job, they typically took care of it themselves. Vernita believed that her mother did not have the lock changed herself, but that the CHA had failed to file the key or misfiled it when they last changed her lock in 1986. The janitor agreed that this was a possibility. "We got 3 carpenters for 4,000 apartments. Every key's not gonna get labeled. Every key cannot get put in its proper place." Besides McCoy's apartment and the one across the hall from which the killers came, only one apartment in that wing of the floor was occupied. The elderly woman and her 2 grown daughters who lived there told police they hadn't heard any gunshots. But the cops will tell you that you have to be skeptical anytime a resident says they've heard or seen nothing, given how rampant intimidation was. Police looking for witnesses there would often find that no one knew nothing about nothing. "If you get labeled an informant over there, you have to move," said Perry Smith, who lived on McCoy's floor until the year before she died. "I've seen people who talk to police get gasoline poured on their apartment door and set on fire." The numerous charred front doors at the Abbott high-rises attested to that. The 2 men arrested by police in the McCoy murder were both residents of Abla. Edward Turner, 19, had been out on bond on a charge of unlawful use of a weapon and was arrested a few days after the murder. On June 9th, police caught the other suspect that they were seeking, 25-year-old John Hondras, after getting a tip. Hondras had previous convictions for robbery and possession of a stolen vehicle, and he was also apparently related to the people leasing apartment 1108. Officers found him hiding under his bed. The defendants were charged with murder, home invasion, armed robbery, armed violence, and residential burglary. The home invasion charge indicates the state believes the killers knew McCoy was home when they broke in. They suggested that the killers wanted McCoy there so she could tell them where she had her money stashed. She didn't flee when she heard the noises in the bathroom, they speculated, because she probably figured if they're coming in from the bathroom, they'd be waiting outside the front door too. She was stuck there, not knowing which way to go. The only security she had was to try to use the telephone to get the police there. That phone was one of at least 3 items stolen from McCoy's apartment. Detectives don't know whether money was also stolen, but only change was found in the apartment. Police recovered her television and rocking chair from the home of one of the defendant's friends, but the phone was never found. And the fact that it was taken is intriguing. Remember that the dispatcher called her number the night she was shot, and the police officers outside her door heard the phone ring. So the phone had to be stolen after police left that night. It also means that the killers might still have been on the 11th floor when the police arrived, hiding out in an apartment, perhaps the adjacent one. Perhaps they were still in McCoy's. It would be nice to report that her death had at least prompted the CHA to resolve the medicine cabinet dilemma. They hadn't taken any steps to remedy the problem before her death, even though several such break-ins had been reported. But it doesn't appear that much was done after, either. The CHA Public Affairs Director, Helen Colvin, minimized the extent of the medicine cabinet problem. She said the agency had received only isolated reports of such break-ins, fewer than 10, and probably only 7 in the last 18 months. But even just a half-dozen reports of such break-ins in 18 months indicates a serious problem. and as many as 3 times as many such break-ins as have been reported have probably occurred because of how often crimes in housing projects go unreported. The janitor said the medicine cabinets could be bolted together and attached to the masonry, so they could be removed only with a power tool. This would make it more difficult for janitors and plumbers to check the pipes, but at least it would stop the break-ins. It would be simple and inexpensive. So why wasn't it done? "Come on," the janitor laughed. "We can't even get wood to put over the openings." People in the projects become hopeless and helpless, he said. They stop dreaming. They don't even have a concept of what it would be like to not be there. But it's like an abused child. They're more comfortable, because at least they know what to expect. The case was pushed back several times, finally going to trial after 3 years. Most of the benches in the courtroom's gallery were empty throughout the trial. A handful of friends and relatives attended in support of the defendants. Only one person was there on behalf of the victim, her brother, Willie McCoy. In a way, the wrong people were on trial for his sister's murder, he said. The defendants ought to be the people who designed projects like Abbott. When they stack people in boxes like sardines, of course there's gonna be violence. What do they expect? All them people's lives in danger. They need to close all the projects down. It's worth noting that the original plans for Chicago housing projects featured smaller communities spread out through middle-class neighborhoods. But the aldermen of the 40s and 50s did everything they could to block those attempts. Citing a lack of evidence, the defendants were cleared of all charges. Thus, nobody has been convicted for murdering Ruthie Mae McCoy, and the case remains unsolved. Judge Michael Getty was openly displeased with the not guilty verdict. "There's more than one tragedy in this case," he said. "The most obvious is the brutal murder, robbery, and home invasion of Ruthie McCoy. The second is the failure of the Chicago Police Department to respond in a professional manner to Ruthie McCoy's impassioned pleas for help." Life was hard for Ruthie Mae, but in the end, she was trying. She was going to school, taking medication, and planning a life beyond the Abbott homes. She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to live. But she was trapped in a fortress of a building that couldn't protect her, and in a system that dismissed her until it was too late, and a city that only noticed her after she was gone. The story of Ruthie Mae McCoy serves as a reminder that even in the most forgotten corners of a city, lives like hers matter, and always should have.